Hello everyone, this is Dr. Granier, and today is Thursday and we are doing the autonomic nervous system, which is chapter 16. This was one of our course objectives that's mentioned in your syllabus, that part of what AMP1 is going to do is get you to be familiar and understand what the autonomic nervous system does, the two divisions, and how they differ from each other. So our goal in this chapter is basically to highlight those things and focus in on that. All right, so the autonomic nervous system is going to be subconscious. It's going to be part of the peripheral nervous system, and where the somatic motor nervous system controlled skeletal muscle, this is going to be the system that operates to control on smooth muscle, glands, and some other items in our body, okay? So autonomic, it comes from that it operates largely outside of our awareness, and it's subdivided into two divisions. The sympathetic division is going to be the division that kind of ramps things up, that makes us able to fight or fly away. So it's going to increase alertness, increase metabolic rate, the burning of sugar, the making of ATP, and make our muscles work a little bit better. So it's going to improve the muscle interactions. It's going to increase heart rate, increase oxygen availability by increasing breathing rate, dilating the bronchioles, trying to make oxygen come more into the system. It does everything to make ATP production enhanced, and therefore force production and output of muscles and power to be enhanced. The parasympathetic division is kind of the opposite of the sympathetic, whereas the sympathetic kind of ramps things up for ATP, the parasympathetic kind of ramps it down. The parasympathetic is called your eat and rest. So it's going to be tied more towards bringing heart rate down, bringing your ATP making ability down, and it's going to promote the absorptive state in the digestive system. So some of the things you have to be able to do is differentiate the two systems. And anatomically, they are different. So if we look at anatomically, the neurons that are tied to the sympathetic nervous system, so physically what is going to be a neuron that is going to release norepinephrine and going to have sympathetic effects on organs, those neurons physically exit the spinal cord in the thoracic and lumbar regions. So that is part of the reason why the sympathetic system is known as the thoracolumbar division. All right, sympathetic and parasympathetic systems are two neurons that leave the spinal cord. So this is where it's different from the somatic motor, because they were one neuron. So the first neuron is always called the preganglionic neuron, and the second neuron is the postganglionic neuron. And where they synapse is going to sometimes be at a ganglia, so sympathetic chain ganglia you hear about. So again, anatomically speaking, we can tell a difference between the sympathetic and the parasympathetic system when we look at just the size of the preganglionic and the postganglionic neurons. So for sympathetics, the preganglionic fibers, or the neurons, are short, meaning they're cell bodies in the spinal cord. It exits out on the ventral root, it joins the nerve, and then very quickly finds a synapsing point with the postganglionic neuron, and so that synapse is very close to the spinal cord. So the sympathetic system has a short or a smaller preganglionic neuron, and then its postganglionic neuron is the one that actually is very long and goes all the way to the target. So that's the target muscle, the target gland, the target organ, and has the effect. Okay? And it's the opposite for the parasympathetic. So it's called, it exits physically out of the spinal cord in the cranial cervical region and the sacral region. So it's cranial cervical. It's going to have short postganglionic fibers. So its preganglionic fibers that leave the spinal cord are going to be physically long, and they're going to travel a much longer distance. So the synapse between those two neurons takes place close to the target. Okay? Now for neurotransmitters, both systems are going to use acetylcholine for the neurotransmitter at the first synapse. So that means the preganglionic neuron always talks to the postganglionic neuron with acetylcholine. The difference then is, what does the postganglionic neuron talk to the organ or the gland or the muscle cell with? And for sympathetics, that's going to be where norepinephrine comes into play. And then for acetylcholine, that's where you're going to have another acetylcholine. So Parasympathetic's always acetylcholine. Sympathetics is acetylcholine for the first synapse and norepinephrine for the second synapse. So again, we end up with different relative symptoms that come out of these things. So effects: fight or flight for sympathetics, rest and digest for parasympathetics. So this is a slide that shows you, again, we're looking at T1 to L2. So right away, that's going to tell you that we are dealing with the sympathetic system, okay? And in red, right, down here in red, these are all the preganglionic fibers. So these are the first neurons of the sympathetic chain. And they are leaving the spinal cord, and they leave through the ventral root, and they are going to go and synapse very close to the spinal cord in this area known as the sympathetic chain ganglia. So it's a gaggle, a space where neurons connect to each other, release neurotransmitter, and it's then that second neuron, the postganglionic neuron, that goes and has their effects, okay? All right, now there is one, of course there's always an exception. So there's one exception to this rule. One neuron is actually, for the sympathetic, is going to, as shown here, is going to go from the spinal cord all the way down to the medulla of the suprarenal gland or the adrenal gland. And so this is the one preganglionic sympathetic neuron that's really long. And then in the adrenal medulla, those cells are somewhat neuro in nature, and so they release epinephrine and norepinephrine, which we'll get into in Chapter 18, which then have an effect of prolonging the sympathetic outflow with continuing to keep the flight or flight response going beyond a few seconds. So they're they prolong the neuronal sympathetic outflow hormonally. Okay? So again, we see physically, anatomically, we got from T1 to L. We have short preganglionic fibers, long postganglionic fibers. We have a synapse in a sympathetic chain ganglia, which is located close to the spinal cord, and we use acetylcholine in this first synapse, and then in all of these organs, so all the way over here, okay, that's where we're going to see norepinephrine be utilized. All right? All right, so again, looking at it, the central nervous system, so this is the spinal cord. Okay, the neuron that leaves and goes to the sympathetic chain ganglia, right, is going to release acetylcholine. And that's whether you're looking at parasympathetics or sympathetics. And then it's the second hormone, so our postganglionic neuron, that is going to go and release norepinephrine. And it's going to have its effect based on which adrenergic receptor is on the target. All right, so this adrenergic receptor responds to norepinephrine or epinephrine. So it responds to both a neurotransmitter and a hormone. You have two types of alphas and two types of betas. Actually, I think there are more that have been discovered now. But in general, there's at least two main alphas and two main betas. And the second messengers, so what norepinephrine does is it interacts its receptor. And what that does is that causes things in the cell to get activated. Those things that are in the cell in some cases are specialized molecules called second messengers. And some of them are going to lead to changes in that target tissue that make it constrict if it's a muscle or dilate if it's a muscle. All right? And so how does it know to constrict one set of muscles and dilate another? It's because it has a different receptor. Okay? So some of the responses we see with sympathetic activity. You get heightened mental alertness. There's more sugar available, so there should be more sugar, glucose in your blood, so the brain should work a little bit more efficiently. You increase metabolic rates. You increase the breakdown and making of ATP, so you have more ATP readily available to maintain function. You reduce blood flow. You reduce your output of digestive and urinary functions, so you don't technically take in food and absorb when you're under sympathetic outflow. And you see that when like people start exercising, they want to wait a while between when they eat and versus when they go exercise. You start utilizing fat, so you mobilize fat. You start mobilizing your glycogen. You break it down into glucose, so you have more potential energy fuel to make into ATP. You're trying to get more oxygen. If you're making more energy, you need more oxygen, so you're going to increase the rate, the depth, and you're going to make more air be able to flow into the lungs, because not only are you going to increase the number of breaths you take, you're going to increase the diameter of the bronchioles, so you can have more air flowing per second. You increase heart rate, so that oxygen you're taking in gets to the cells quicker. And again, because you're distributing blood in different ways, you're going to alter blood pressure. So you're going to constrict certain places and you're going to dilate in other places. And because you're going to increase heat output, you want to start sweating so you can start the evaporative processes to keep your body temperature low. On the parasympathetic division, again, we have preganglionic fibers originate at the brainstem or at the sacrum, so they are known as craniosacral. They travel a long distance, and they actually synapse in the ganglia close or near their target. So they have, again, the opposite, long preganglionic fibers, short postganglionic fibers. They are going to stimulate lots of visceral activities inside the gut and the belly, and they are going to promote energy conservation and sedentary activities. So that's why they're eat and rest. So when we look at it, again, it's going to come out of the brainstem, out of the cervical region, and it's going to be out of the sacral. The reds are long, and then we see all of our synapses here, in many cases, are very close, if not on top of the target organ. Okay? Acetylcholine is going to be our neurotransmitter in both spots. And so what we normally see is decreased metabolic rates. We don't need as much oxygen. We don't make as much ATP. We don't need to push the blood through. We alter and we open back up certain blood vessels that can dilate so blood can flow. We increase secretion by salivary and digestive glands. We increase motility and blood flow to the digestive tract. And we have urine and defecation stimulation again. Okay? So major effects of the sympathetic, they constrict the pupils, so they restrict the amount of light that enters the eyes, and they focus the lens of the eyes on nearby objects. They work on gastric glands to get their secretions up and going, in many cases because food's being absorbed, food's being broken down. They do support some secretion of hormones. They change blood flow. A big thing about erectile dysfunction is you have a problem with nitric oxide getting your penile tissue to dilate and let blood flow into the penis. And so parasympathetics is tied to being able to get an erection. Okay. So again, looking at the acetylcholine, it's the neurotransmitter in both spots. It's the neurotransmitter between the preganglionic and the postganglionic fiber, and again at the postganglionic to the target tissue. And just like with muscles, acetylcholinesterase is located in the synaptic cleft, so that way when acetylcholine is released, we can very quickly remove it by breaking it into acetyl and choline. And yeah. What am I doing? Stop. Okay. All right. So next slide. All right, so this receptors. So acetylcholine is going to cause certain things to dilate, certain things to constrict, certain things to release secretions, certain things not to release secretions. So it has to have two different receptors because it's using the same neurotransmitter. And those two receptors are nicotinic receptors and muscarinic receptors, okay? Your nicotinic receptors, as this little diagram over here shows, are normally going to be your receptors between the preganglionic and the postganglionic fibers. And so basically the nicotinic receptors are found in both the sympathetic and the parasympathetic system. All right, and they are going to be on ganglionic cells, and the exposure to acetylcholine causes excitation. So the graded potentials are going to be EPSPs that bring the neuron from resting towards that threshold, that negative 60 millivolts, that generates an action potential. down the axon. And then for acetylcholine at the second point, it's going to use a different cholinergic receptor, which is your muscarinic receptor. Right? There are very few of these in the sympathetic system, but for the most part, these are located in just the parasympathetic. Okay? And the muscarinic receptor is going to use G proteins, so we'll get into more of that with endocrine. And G proteins are going to have changes in the cell with second messengers, so like cyclic AMP or cyclic GMP. And those things, those second messengers, those molecules, those proteins, those modified, basically little molecules in the cell, in the cytoplasm, are going to go and have effects, change gene transcription, change message RNA lifespan, change protein synthesis, change turning things, enzymes on, turning enzymes off, turning on glycolysis, turning off glycolysis, turning on fat breakdown, turning off fat breakdown. It's going to have all these different effects depending on the tissue. Okay? And so that is your two receptors for cholinergic or acetylcholine, right? Now the other branch of the autonomic system is the enteric nervous system, and we normally don't talk much about it because the enteric nervous system is actually thought of as almost like a second brain. It's autonomic in that we don't think about it, and it's some of the specific nerves that come off throughout the spinal cord, so it's located all over the spinal cord, but these nerves are heading specifically to the gut, all right? And so they are going to specifically coordinate gastric movements, so movement of food through the alimentary canal, and are going to tie in with hormones from the gut to make sure that food is being moved at a rate that allows maximizing absorption. And as you see here, it goes all the way into the almost the epithelial layers, the mucosa layer, and some of the outer parts, which this is the muscularis layer, so it controls the muscles that line the alimentary canal or the GI tract. So it's going to play a big role in motility or movement of food through the system. Okay, and that's really all I'm going to say on that. All right, so again, some of our differences, parasympathetic versus sympathetic. We have thoracic, thoracolumbar. We have short preganglionic versus long postganglionic, acetylcholine, and then norepinephrine. We have alpha and beta adrenergic receptors that have their effects. For parasympathetic, it's craniosacral. We have long preganglionic, short postganglionic. We have acetylcholine. Nicotinic is the first receptor normally for both systems between the preganglionic and the postganglionic. So this is nicotinic receptors. And then it's muscularic for the second and adrenergic for the sympathetics, right? And you might recognize nicotinic because of nicotine. So this is where nicotine is working. So nicotine is actually causing potentially stimulation in both sympathetic and parasympathetic systems. Alrighty, so that is our autonomic nervous system, and read more, again, to get the more details and specifics in Chapter 16. And then we have Chapter 17 on Tuesday, and next Thursday, Chapter 18. This will come back into play in Chapter 18. We'll learn more about G proteins. We'll learn more about epinephrine and norepinephrine from the suprarenal gland up here, right? And we'll talk about prolonging the sympathetic effect with hormones. Okay, I will see y'all, I guess, Tuesday and Monday on the, if anyone makes it, 9:30 online here for Blackboard Collaborate.